Still have a little bit of a cough, so I apologize. We're in Hebrews chapter 13, which I do believe is the last book of or last chapter of Hebrews. So we're going to be going through something else pretty soon. And I should remind you all that if you have something on your heart, something you want to go through, I like to do that in our in-between books. That can be topical or whatever you want to do. So let me know, and we'll get you doing that. Wait for my dad here. Good morning, Dad. We are in Hebrews chapter 13. All right. So last week we finished up Hebrews chapter 12, kind of went off on a little bit of a tangent but still that chapter was pretty cool. I like that. And we're going to switch to 13. And so the author, you have to be aware the author is going to transition to concluding statements here. So there's going to be a lot of the way this conclusion works, like a lot of conclusions, is they want to repeat the most important thing. But a lot of times there's also just a lot of little tidbits here and there. We're like, don't forget about this and don't forget about this, and something that this is how it is in life, right? If you're going on a trip and you're about to leave, somebody's like, hey, they got to give you a whole bunch of little last minute things. And so we got that going on right here where there's a lot of that little last minute stuff going on. And so we're going to see that. But before we do that, I just want to remind us of the context of the book because I think this is important, and we might miss some of the difficulties of the things. The author is going to point out some things that are can be difficult, can be hard, but I think if you add on top of it the context that this whole book is written about, it's even more amazing some of the things that the author is saying. And that context is that the Jews are starting to face persecution. Life is starting to become hard, and if you recall the kind of the main point going through this book is that Jesus is better. And the point of that is because some of the Jews were being persecuted for being Christians, and they were looking at, well, maybe I should just go back to the Mosaic law and Judaism and do that and not have to worry about this whole Jesus thing, and then I won't face the persecution and all that stuff. So there's that side of things going on. And so we're going to look at that. And I think, like I said, if we look at that in that context, we're going to see some of the things that the author says are going to be like, wow, I don't know about that. But anyways, so that's where we are. We're going to start with verse 1 and 2. Bill, would you mind reading verse 1 and 2 of chapter 13?
Keep loving on one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it.
So right off the bat, the author says something that I think is really interesting about these angels. But before we get to that, let's just back up to verse 1 here. And it says, on my end, it says, let brotherly love continue. What do you think this is talking about? How are we supposed to show brotherly love to each other?
Well, we need to admonish one another. That's brotherly love, the tough love. And love thy neighbor.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Yeah, I don't have any brothers, so I imagine brothers do a lot of hitting each other, but I could be wrong. I don't have brothers, so maybe you guys know better. What were you going to say, Bill?
and also help them when they're struggling with something,
Yeah.
Scripture indicates we should greet each other with a kiss.
Wow. Don't push it too far there, Tim.
That's brotherly love. That's what Paul tells us.
Interesting, huh?
That's why they had beards.
Then be greeted with a slap.
Okay, that would work. I'm pretty sure that if I went up to Tim and gave him a kiss, he might slap me or
Just turn the
punch me.
cheek then.
Depends
Okay.
on what church you're in, John.
Yeah, I suppose so.
And what country?
Brethren church, that's a standard greeting.
And what church
Brethren,
is a kiss?
yeah. Men come up and kiss each other. My
It's a
brother,
standard greeting in a lot of countries too.
yeah. My brother
Yeah.
married a girl that was from the Brethren church, and he told me all about it. But I've never seen it myself, but
Okay.
I think the
That's-
German Baptists and Brethren are the ones that do it.
All right. So here's another question for you. Remember, this is the early church. Do you think the Jews were part of that brotherly love? Who do you think, I guess I should back up. Who do you think are the people that they're supposed to be showing brotherly love to? So it says, let brotherly love continue. Who's in that group of brothers? Who is in that group of people that you're supposed to treat this way? Is it everybody? Is it just some people?
It's everybody.
You think it's everybody?
Well, just the part about the entertaining the strangers, you know, I've heard, I can't tell you how many people say it on the news when they do something kind. Is my mother always told me that God sends angels, and it might be one of God's angels, so you have to be nice to everyone, and that always has stuck with me. And so, yeah, brotherly love. I think in this aspect, close within the church, when I'm talking about admonishing people.
Yeah.
But as far
Yeah.
as loving your neighbor as yourself, that goes with everyone.
I feel like Jason wants to say something and he's looking for the mute button.
Trying to figure
There.
out John's computer here and his little setup. When I see scripture, I see a different type of love depending upon the object of the love. Like was pointed out, there's the neighbor, there's love your enemy, there's love your wife. I always found it interesting that Jesus said that the world would know you're my disciples by the way you love one another. So that's the only identifying marker he talks about is the way we love one another, which tells me that love is going to be distinct and unique from how the world loves one another. And so I think there is a very separate, unique, and distinct way that the brothers and sisters within the church love one another. That's going to be only associated with the way of being a disciple of Christ. So I think it's distinct and unique to the church in that manner. So, which will have a bleed over into the other areas, but it will still be enough of an identifying marker where the world will say, "Hey, these are disciples of Jesus Christ," because that love, that's different than what I'm used to. So,
And there's an interesting aspect here too, because if we're talking about other followers of Jesus, we might not actually know the person, but if we know that the person is a follower of Jesus, right, then we might show them a different type of love than we would for others. And being in the habit of treating people that you don't know very well in this particular way, absolutely, there's going to be some bleed over where you're going to start treating other people in a better way than you might normally. So I agree. That's interesting. I'm curious too if you think that the brotherly love would include the Jews here or if it wouldn't include the Jews here. What do you think about that, Jason?
are you referring to the Jews that have not accepted Christ, or are you referring Jews
Yeah.
versus Gentiles?
Yeah, Jews versus Gentiles, because this is an interesting time, right? As some of the Jews are converting over to Christianity, and again, part of the context of this book is some of those Jews were thinking of going back to
Right.
Judaism. I'm curious. I don't know the answer to this. I'm just curious if you think that this brotherly love included some of the Jews, or maybe it didn't. I don't know.
I think it includes the Jews because he's writing to the Jews. He's writing to the Hebrews, so to me, the Jews would be included in that.
Yeah, when you look through the New Testament and you look at the interchanging between brothers, brethren, and all that stuff, sometimes Paul refers to his brethren, but more genetically than it does spiritually. I think in this context, it's spiritually, which means it would include any person that follows Christ, Jew or Gentile.
Okay.
Just
This
for the
is-
use of the term brotherly love, because I think that's the only way that that would be understood, and
Yeah.
not so.
Yeah. Yeah, and this. Oh, go ahead. Somebody was going to say something, I think.
No, I just messed up his computer and laughed. I just don't know what I did.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I like this whole picture, and this whole picture of brotherly love too is interesting just because if you have brothers, if you have sisters, like I said, I don't have a brother, but I do have some sisters, and I do know like my sister Rochelle, she lives in Texas, and we don't agree on everything, but at the same time, she's my sister. So if she ever needed help or something, she knows that I'd help her if I could. And if she needs a place to stay, she would always be welcome to come and stay with me. So there's this brotherly, sisterly type of love that we have that is different than I would have with other people. And it's a good picture. I like this whole picture because we have family, and a lot of times family is great, and there are times where having too much family can be difficult. I'm not going to say bad, but it can be difficult, right? But at the same time, you have to love them, and you know that, and you love them, even though you might be in an argument, even though you might struggle with, just how it is when you're with your family. So, again, I want to point out one other aspect of this, which is still really interesting, which is the fact that they're starting to get persecuted. And so some of this is a little bit difficult. How do you know if that person is a Christian? How do if a person says they're a Christian and you start trying to show them brotherly love, and then it turns out that they're actually there to persecute you? If you recall, we also have Paul or Saul during this time, and he's looking for the Christians. Oh, you're a Christian? Okay, I got papers from the church that says we can do things like imprison you and stuff like that. So you don't want to just like openly write out on the front of your house, "Hey, I'm a Christian," because you might end up in prison, right? And actually, we're going to see some aspects of this later on in this chapter where some people were in prison, and they were being imprisoned because they were following Jesus. So that this adds this other just nuance to this fact that you have to show brotherly love to someone who might be a stranger, but at the same time, you're going to be a little scared because if they recognize you're a Christian and they're out to persecute you, that could be dangerous. And so it adds this extra tension, I think, on this whole thing. And one of the things that came out of this, which I think is really interesting, is the fish symbol, and I can't pronounce, what is it, the iski or icky, or I don't know. But that whole
Ixtis.
thing, there you go, ixthis. It's all Greek to me, I don't know. So they would put these symbols on places where Christians would meet so that they would recognize it, so they would recognize each other. They would put these symbols on their buildings, on their houses, so people would know they were Christians, but it was a symbol that wasn't really, nobody else really knew about. So it was kind of this way that they could show that they were other Christians. There's even some, I have heard this, I don't know how true it is, but I have read that even sometimes if they were walking with a stranger on a path, then what they might do is they might draw half of a circle, this arc, and then the other person, if they were a Christian, they would recognize that and they would draw the other half, which would turn it into a fish. And there was this idea that they could do this and recognize each other, and then they could show that brotherly love and do it in a way that was kind of clever without having to worry about being persecuted.
I was talking
So,
to my daughter about that last night on the way to
yeah,
soccer practice. And I
it's
remember
pretty
that
cool.
my neighbor's babysitter told him the story, and I thought that was so cool. I've always loved secret symbols and handshakes and stuff like that.
And this is one of the ways that this early church tried to practice some of the things that the author of Hebrews is mentioning here, and do it in a way where they kind of felt a little bit more safe, and they could do it in a way where they could expose themselves without exposing themselves too greatly. And so it's just really interesting how clever people can be sometimes. But I think the main point of this whole, even the symbols, is what they were trying to do is practice some of these things. Practice brotherly love and hospitality to strangers who were also followers of Jesus, which is pretty cool. All right. Next, it says in verse 2, do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so you have unwittingly entertained angels. This is crazy, right? I mean, this is amazing for on multiple levels, I think. What's the big deal? First of all, what is the big deal? You entertain some people and some of them turn out to be angels. So what? Why is that a big deal? Why do you think that's a big deal?
I'm not, I don't know if I have that full answer, but I do know that hospitality is a big deal because it's one of the requirements for an elder in First Timothy 3, right? If the person he cannot show hospitality, then he's not qualified to be an elder, which tells me it puts it up on a high level of importance in showing this hospitality. The purpose and the reason behind that, I don't know, but I know that it's extremely important to be hospitable. Maybe that's the loving your neighbor, that's loving your enemy, even showing hospitality. And so I don't know, but I just wanted to call out that I recognize that it's important in Scripture.
And you don't know who you're going to be. I think what Paul's trying to, or whoever wrote this, Apollos or whoever wrote this book, they're trying to get you to think about everyone. In other words, treat everyone the same. In other words, don't be different to different people. That's one of the things that he didn't like about the Sadducees and the Pharisees is they treated everybody differently. If you were rich, they treated you one way. If you're poor, they treated you another. If you were sick, it was all those things came together. Is treat everyone the same. And I think he threw in the angels because he's saying basically God's looking at you. He's watching everything you do. So that's my thoughts on it.
Matthew 25:40 is what Jesus says, in so much as ye have done unto the least of my brethren, ye have done to me. And that's one of those that always sticks in my head, to make sure you treat everybody kind. That undercover boss comes into my head. I'm not sure, the show where the owner of the company goes in as a little peon and they see how they treat him. And it's one of those things you never know. Could be an angel, but you gotta be nice to everybody. And the one thing that's really helped me in some of these times where I don't necessarily agree with everything going on around me is Jesus died for everyone. And so we have to keep that in our mind. Jesus died for everyone. We have to love them, as hard as it may be. It's just my 2 cents.
And this goes back to the Old Testament, right? There's 2 or 3 references in the Old Testament about people interacting with someone and they didn't know it was an angel. I know Abraham was one, and there was a couple in Judges, the book of Judges, where people interacted with angels and didn't even realize it. So that would also ring a bell to some Jewish people because they were familiar with the Old Testament.
Yeah, Jacob comes upon a whole camp of angels at one point. It's pretty crazy. Go ahead, Rich. I'm sorry.
I mean, with hospitality, I think, we live in an age of hotels and Airbnbs. So I think it's important to kind of think through the context. Back then, you go from town to town, there wasn't necessarily, maybe one inn or whatever. I think as people were going around, especially missionaries or teams of people that were kind of going around, that's probably part of the command to be, hey, be hospitable. Because I think it's more than, hey, come over for lunch. It's more stay over my house so I can take care of you. And that's a really interesting, we don't necessarily do that anymore for strangers here because they don't need to, because they can go to the Holiday Inn or whatever. But back then, I think that's different. I wonder if this is part of that as well. As Christians, we're moving from place to place for a variety of reasons.
That's a very good point. Because if you have someone at your house, you need to stop your life for them, especially if it's a stranger, right? You can't just, yeah, have at it, guys. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if a little bit is trying to get them to break out of their cultural mode, because they were very much separatists, right? The Jews didn't associate with anybody that was not a part of their group, right? And so not to neglect showing hospitality to even strangers, because we even have it today. We have some religious groups that are very separatist, and they sit there and nobody from the outside can come in, right? Where, like it was mentioned, Jesus was for everyone. So it's everyone's open and welcome to come in. And so kind of get them to break that cultural mode, or cultural of just, it's just about them, but opening it up to everybody.
Entertaining the angels is an interesting concept there. And I think of a guy witnessing to another guy, and these angels are watching him. And let's take it that one guy does something nice to this non-believer, and the angels that are watching him are going, yeah, cool, keep it up. And there's this spiritual battle going on there for this person's soul. So I think we entertain angels all sorts of ways in our lives that we lead, and the way we treat our wives, and the way we treat our children, the way we treat everybody around us. We're entertaining angels. But it's not necessarily, people that look like angels that come to the earth, and I'm sure they're there. But to entertain angels, just lead a godly life and watch what happens.
I think
That's
also-
interesting. So I think you're saying that we entertain the angels not by showing hospitality to them, but showing hospitality to somebody else, and the angels are there viewing that. Interesting. Okay.
I think the angels are being entertained by watching us fumble around trying to do the things we're doing. It was like those videos of somebody falling all the time. I think they're looking
They're
at us.
entertained by that.
Man, you really think that's going to work?
There's probably a lot of, really, Jesus, you did that for that person? Sure. So I this is all very good. This is all interesting. I just want to bring up another little point here, which I think is really cool, which is some aspect of this which we might be missing, which is that we might be thinking the angels are there, and this is kind of like a test for us, that they're coming in and we're showing them hospitality, and that's kind of a test that God is kind of testing us with. But I don't think that's what's going on here. It is so this word angels, it literally means messenger. And we have to understand that, because not always in the Bible is an angel this supernatural being. It could be a person, it could be a group. It's a messenger. And the point of that is that God has a purpose or a message for somebody. So he sends someone to go convey that message. And what this does is this puts us in this part of this whole process where we are encouraging that person, and we are showing hospitality to them. And I like this idea of strangers. We could be entertaining strangers that are messengers, and we have no idea about any of that stuff going on. And so it's not that we're being tested, but it is that God has a plan to provide somebody with a message, and we happen to be part of that plan without realizing or recognizing that we're actually part of anything that is going on. And so I really like this whole concept. I like this idea because it shows us that God has a plan to speak to people. He sends messengers, he sends angels. Now, sometimes they might be supernatural beings, sometimes they might be people, but he wants people to hear messages, and he's got a plan. And somehow we can be involved in that plan is pretty amazing in one aspect. But it's also pretty cool that it shows that just by showing hospitality to someone, it could further that plan. And that's a pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing because that's, we can think of evangelism, we can think of these things, and for some people, this can be a very scary, very tough type of thing. And here, what we're being told is, but if you just start showing hospitality to other people, you can be part of that whole process, part of that plan without having to do all the scary stuff, except that you're showing hospitality to others. And I think that that's pretty cool. But it also, another important aspect of this is we may never have any idea of the impact that we had with God's plan, right? We could be part of his plan and he can use us for something that he's planning on doing. And we would never even know that God's plan was to send a message to somebody else over in some other area. And that's a really important aspect that I really like. I know John brought up that passage in Matthew, and I like how there's the sheep and the goats with God, and the people are like, when did I do this? And Jesus is, well, you did it when you did it to this person, or when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me. And there's that idea of we could be doing something to further God's plan without actually being aware of it, and that's pretty cool.
Hey, John, I just want to add
Yeah.
to that too, is I think it also, it just wants us to be in a spirit of humility, a willingness to do what needs to get done, and so if we're operating and walking around with the spirit of humility, these things will come more naturally for us. And so I think the spirit behind it is a constant and continuous spirit of humility. So when the opportunity does come, because you're already humble, and that's how Christ walked around, he always was in a spirit of humility. So he's always thinking not only his own needs, but the needs of others, so that whatever the need came, it was easy for him to just go ahead and respond to that need, even if it was criticism that he needed to criticize the Pharisees. He was very willing to humble himself to criticize the Pharisees. But I think it's just a spirit of humility that is really makes it easier to operate and do these things.
It's a good point, Mark, because hospitality is to some degree a burden. It may not be a heavy burden, it may not be a hard burden. It might, though, right? Hospitality is a burden because you have to give up something of yours to somebody else. And even in this context, it's a stranger. You're giving up maybe your resources, maybe your time. You're giving something else up for a person you might not even know. And that's definitely, there is some humility that has to be involved there. Yeah.
This is also a subtle reminder by Paul, whoever wrote the book, to the Jews who did not believe in a spirit world. And he's emphasizing the aspect that there is actually a spiritual world that they're not seeing, they may not be paying attention to, or even giving credence to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of this whole idea of this particular verse is there's a lot going on that you aren't even aware of. So you need to behave and you need to act in this manner because you're not aware of what's going on. And that is real, right? That is true. We really have very limited understanding of what's going on. For some of us, even in our own lives and even in what we're doing today, we have very little understanding of the reality of what's going on. So it's a good point. I like that. All right. Any other thoughts? I thought this verse was incredible. I think the whole concept of throwing an angel in there into this verse, that would make me step back and go, wait a second, what? Why? But I like this.
Yeah, I think that that I think this is like an opportunity to do the world versus God's kingdom kind of thing, and how people treat others, and there's always in the world, you always put people on pedestals and stuff, and then you have your own hidden, you got your agenda and you got your own personal motivations for doing stuff and everything. And I don't know. I mean, I think that, in God's kingdom, we should, like I think it was Jason was saying, just treat everybody, from a perspective of how Jesus treats everyone, right? And don't show more favoritism for one person over another because it could be an angel, you know what I mean? And because if you knew someone was an angel, boy, you would just be all fired up, right? You'd have them on a pedestal and you'd, right, want to, hey, I'm going to invite all my buddies over. We're going to, worship this guy maybe. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just there's that whole thing. So I think a lot of this you need to look at God's kingdom. You got to look at the world view on stuff and how people treat because my experience is there's a real big difference on how people approach things based on that motivation. Anyways.
Good. It's all good. I love this. All right. Verse 3. Let's see. Dad, you mind reading verse 3?
Now, remember them that are in bonds. Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them, and them which suffer adversity as being yourself also in the body.
Yeah, so again, a lot of little short things, but now we switch to remember the people that are imprisoned or bound or mine says prisoners as if chained with them. The idea is they're prisoners, they're in prison. Remember them like you're there with them. And this is an interesting concept. Why do you think we need to be told to remember those people who are in prison?
Because it's easy to forget when you're not
Yeah.
there, or we're not there when you're separated from some of those persecutions because they're somewhere else.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And just to add another aspect to it, he mentions those who are mistreated. So these people are in prison, they're being mistreated. They're there because they're following Jesus, right? They're there not because they did something wrong, not because they were committing crimes. They're there because of their faith and their following of Jesus. And so we're reminded to remember them. Don't forget about those people. And honestly, I think in our culture, this might be one of the hardest aspects of this whole chapter for us is remembering those people who aren't with us. If somebody drops off and starts not showing up to church, it's easy to forget those people. It's easy to forget our brothers and sisters who we've even had lots of conversations with them, but then just the way our culture is, right? You have to self-initiate. You have to be the one who gets involved in things. And if you stop getting involved, then people can forget about you. So I think this is one of those things that we have to remember, or that is important for us. And it's not the idea that they're in prison for following Jesus, but just the idea that there are brothers and sisters and they are no longer with us. And so that's for me, this is one of those things that speaks to me that's hard. It also mentions that since you yourselves are in the body also, and this isn't talking about being in the body of church, this is talking about having a physical body. So these people were, again, they're being persecuted, they're in prison, all for following Jesus, and the author is reminding them, you could be that person. There's no reason why you couldn't be that person. If you're a follower of Jesus and they're being persecuted for that, that could also happen to you. So there's the empathy side of this of, hey, it could be you, so you might want to empathize with these people. But I think there's another aspect of this too, because uh, we have something we could do. We can pray for these people, right? And that can have an influence. And it's similar to this entertaining angels aspect where you could pray for someone and not know that it had any impact, but it could have an impact. And so I think that might be this aspect of remembering might be there might be more to it than just prayer, but I think there is this aspect that we could pray for people and intercede for people who aren't with us and have an impact on them without realizing it. So this is all really cool. I like that.
Hey, John, I was thinking of when the church was praying for Paul and what happened out of there. Now, I assume that they were specifically praying for him to be released, or maybe they were not, maybe praying for, a better outcome or God to move in a mighty way, not knowing what God was going to specifically do and how he's going to do it. So to your point, those prayers of those brothers and sisters that are away for whatever reason, we don't know what the end result, how God can use those prayers to support that individual at that time. I think of the people in China and other communities that are having to go underground and having to have church underground or secret locations and stuff like that. Just praying for them and just praying, as they're under different types of persecution than we are. So, kind of to your point.
I would even push it just a little bit further than that, Mark, because we don't really know what impact any of the prayers had on Paul, right? All we know is that Paul wrote a whole bunch of really great stuff that was inspired by the Holy Spirit that we have access to now. Maybe all of that as a result of people praying for Paul, but we don't know. And that's the crazy thing, is we may not get to know during this lifetime what impact we had on others just through things like prayer. It's pretty incredible. Maybe Paul, one of the reasons that Paul was so successful in the successful is kind of a weird way of saying things with Paul, but maybe one of the reasons that Paul had such a big impact on the church was because maybe there was a lot of people praying for him. I mean, maybe that's the part of the reason. We don't know all of this, and that's the cool thing about it. Is what we do know is that prayer does have a real impact on our world, even if we don't know what it is. I like all of this. All right. Verse 4. Verse 4 is fun. Let's see. John, are you up for reading verse 4?
Absolutely. Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge.
All right. So for me, I think this is like, where did this come from? Author of Hebrews. I don't know if it was Paul. There's been a lot of references to Paul this morning, but where did this come from? But this is interesting. Marriage is honorable among all, and I like this idea. In that time, in that culture, this idea was, hey, getting married, that's a good thing. There's honor. Everybody understands the value of marriage. And at that time, at least, there was this understanding that marriage was good for society. But it's also really interesting because marriage was good, but being faithful to your wife, that's not a big deal, right? Particularly among the Greeks, they had all of these religions where that was part, being unfaithful to your wife, that was part of the worship for these other gods. So this is all really interesting, where God is saying, or the author of this book is saying, hey, marriage is a good thing. It's a great thing, but you can't have it both ways. You can't be married and start and just fulfill your flesh by just having sex or sleeping with anybody that you want to. That doesn't work. That doesn't glorify God. And I love this where it says, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And I think the point the author is bringing up here is that God values marriage more than man does, and in a different way, because he says it's not just marriage, it's the commitment that you make and all these other aspects that go with it. You can't have one without the other. If you do, it's not real, and God's going to take care of that. He's going to judge. So I think that this is really interesting. We had read earlier in chapter 12 where it talked about fornicators, and we showed how in context, that was just talking about fulfilling the flesh, and it that was the idea here. It called Esau a fornicator, And the idea there was that, you know, he was just whatever he needed to do to fulfill the flesh, that's what he was going to do. And we have some of that aspect here, but I just want to point out that definitely we're talking about marriage. So in this context, this is what you think of fornicators and adulterers. This is exactly what we think of when we read this. But I just want to point that out, and this is really interesting. If their culture valued marriage, what do you think our culture feels about that? Do you think marriage is still honorable among all? What do you guys think about that?
Absolutely not. Not among all.
Why do you think that is?
I think nowadays people get married for the wrong reasons. I know too many people and have been a part. I don't know if I'm a wedding jinx or what, man, but I've been in a lot of weddings, and I think there's only 2 that I've been in that are still together. I think about people that I know that have got married, whether it was for money or because they had kids and they felt like they had to. I don't know what kind of examples they had growing up. I know my parents had been married for 40 some odd years before my father passed. I didn't know until I had been married that they had each been married before. I had no idea. That was all news to me. That was a very interesting story how that came about. But I don't know. I think it has to do with the example that's set before you and the expectations that you have going in. And I think about why you got married in the first place. Is it because you didn't want to spend the rest of your life without that individual? Or is it because you thought you'd be able to get something from it that you couldn't get otherwise?
I think that many people go into relationships and don't want to make a commitment of marriage now. And I saw that the majority of people toward the end of my career weren't married when they're having children. And it just doesn't hold the family together very well if you aren't willing to make any kind of formal commitment to someone.
And I think the definition of what is honorable and dishonorable matters, because if you don't have a reference as to what that means and it's a personal application of things only, then you begin to mess it up because you may only understand one portion of it. You know, maybe I know how to honor my marriage when I first get married. Well, how do I continue in that, or the latter parts of marriage, or when life difficult? So I think it's, you know, I think people quit because at the end of the day, they didn't think this is what it entails or involves, right? The ultimate commitment to anything, you know, till death do us part. And anything means anything. and you know, honoring that vow before God, I think is very, very important, but is probably secondary in most people's minds, as opposed to my expectations versus the world's expectations versus what happens to me, or how is this, you know. So there's a lot of things that in play that we toss honor out because we forget who exactly are we honoring here in this relationship, versus defining it in the way that we want to take advantage, or maybe is a blessing to us. But I think honoring God in the midst of difficulty is part of this in the marriage, and that's not always on the top of people's minds, because I think it's difficult. I mean, it's hard because even within the church, right? I mean, we'd love to say the church, you know, is different from the world, but it's not. Statistically speaking, I think maybe it is improved, praise God. But it goes back to who exactly are we honoring, and why do we stay within the marriage to do the things that we ought to do? And apart from Christ, that's really, really difficult, because as soon as the shift goes from, well, my wife doesn't do this, and my husband doesn't do this, therefore I don't have to do that, then we blow the whole thing up altogether.
Yeah.
So
I think also there's 1,000 definitions and ways and all this stuff that, I mean, there's only one way ultimately, of an objective way, God's way, but that's only if you align yourself with a biblical worldview. And
Yeah.
so then now you just have all of these different quote unquote styles and ways, and even got different definitions now. I mean, you know, so now it's just a complete, you know, so anyone coming into a marriage or even thinking about a marriage, or they don't even have a clear sign or indication, or what is it? What's the meaning behind it? What was the purpose behind it? You know, and and no one really talks about that. What does it mean? What, you know, what are the actual implications, especially the spiritual aspect of it? I think the spiritual aspect of it, I've never really heard like a study on the spiritual aspects of it,
Of marriage.
to get a marriage, to get a greater understanding. I know it's a marriage between Christ and his bride. I understand that, but I think it's even deeper spiritually in the sexual portion of it. When you are intimate with your spouse, I think there's something there that's untapped and has not been explained. And these are why we have these huge ripple effects that people can't, you know, we've just used it as a transaction, and God never intended it. And there's so many ripple effects because it's transactional, that we all don't have a clear understanding of exactly what's happening when we consummate. And I think that's another aspect that has to be have clarity upon, so people can really understand, like, yeah, you can get a divorce, but all that consummation that you had, that has a ripple effect, and it has implications spiritually that you'll never be able to get around, etc. So sorry, it's very complex. It's a very complex thing.
It kind of is. It kind of isn't, because I agree with what you're saying, Mark, because if we just even take a step back and say, what is marriage? Our culture has a completely different idea of what marriage is now than what God is saying marriage is, right? And part of that is, people will say, well, I am willing to have this commitment with this other person, so that should count as a marriage. And that's not what God said. That God's like, nope, the commitment is not the only aspect. In fact, this is the point of this, is the commitment is an aspect of the marriage, but it's not the only aspect of marriage. You can't, a man can't marry a man, a woman can't marry a woman. I know I could get in a lot of trouble for saying that, but I'm just pointing that out, that that's not God's plan for marriage. And so if you follow something else, and you want to change what the word marriage means so that it incorporates your view, you can't expect the same outcome. You can't expect the same thing, because that wasn't God's plan. And so this is a very, I really enjoy this verse, because what we see here is God saying, hey, you don't get to make the choice. You don't get to define what it is. And specifically, the author is telling the Christians, you're going to see a lot of different variations of what marriage looks like in the world. Don't do any of those. God's going to judge if you start following those ways. You only get to do marriage the way God said that you can do marriage. And that includes the fact that you only have one spouse and you only are intimate with that one person, right? So I like how this verse, it seems to come out of nowhere in my mind, but I know the author's wrapping it up, so I know that they're bringing up these little points, and maybe this was an aspect in the Christian church at that time where the author's just warning them, don't follow marriage like these other people, because you got to follow it according to God's plan.
If you're gonna do a study on that little topic, Williams, let me know. I'm gonna see if my wife will volunteer with me.
Hey, bring it. We're about ready to finish this book, so you could just lead us through it.
I was saying that I would love to hear someone dive into that topic, and I was trying to hit towards John, and I guess the other John responded to it and redirected it back.
You're someone. I like it. Any other comments about this? I don't think we have time to jump into the next verse, but I just really enjoy this particular one.
I mean, to Mark's comment, I don't think I definitely think they're related because as far as the marriage bed and honoring marriage, very, very, because that is the outward expression where we dishonor things. Because that's where it ends up being
Yeah.
in a lot of different ways, whether that's having sex with someone else, having sex outside of marriage, adulterers and fornication, right? Which is in the same verse. It's directly related because marriage is the thing that gives that privilege and the blessing and the oneness that we carry outside. So you can't have a conversation. And it's really interesting because some people want to separate that out, but you can't really have a conversation about what is honorable in marriage without touching sex. Because
true.
that's the expression of it. And I think that's an interesting study also its own. Agree with Mark on that standpoint.
You agree with Mark that he should do a study through this and share it
No,
with
just
us?
pointing out the mystery of consummation, in that sense. I think that we innately know.
Yeah.
We know because of the, whether that's a blessing of it or the stupidity of our mistakes. In that way, we innately know there's something wrong when we step outside of that versus remaining in it. And I think it's it'd be interesting to explore that, but anyhow.
I like it. Yep. All right. Any other thoughts or comments before we finish? I thought we might get further. I'm excited for the next chunk, but we'll have to hold that off until next week. It's pretty cool. It's a quote from Psalms, and I gotta be honest, I really like David. He's got some great things that he said. So we'll look at
God
that
does
next
too.
week. Yes, that's true. He does like
Gave
David.
him a special label. So
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, then I think we'll finish up here. Let's see. Tim, would you mind praying for us?